Welcome everybody. I am Chris Isakowitz. I am the program director for the program that we have here in Business Intelligence and Analytics. And I'd like to welcome you to our next Small Talks about Big Data. Today we are very fortunate to have Dr. Winter Mason talk to us about his area of research, which is inferring group identities through social media, a very important topic. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Mason.
Thank you. So this is work that I'm doing with a graduate student, Asaf Beasley from Indiana University. He won a training grant to come out here last summer and work with me, and this is the project that sort of resulted. We're actually, I'm going to say, maybe a third of the way through the project, and so the results that I'm going to talk about today are just an intermediate step along the way. I'll tell you all about it. So the thing that we're focusing on is this concept of group identity. And group identity is defined in this classic paper by Turner and Oakes as those aspects of a person's self-concept based upon their group memberships together with their emotional value and other psychological correlates. To understand what this means, think about the groups that you belong to. For some of these groups, not all of them, for some of these groups, you actually think of yourself as being a blank, right? I am a scientist. I don't just do science, I am a scientist, right? And you can think of a lot of groups where this is true for people, and politics is true for some people. Some people really are Democrats. Some people vote Democrat, consistently, more often than not, right? But some people are Democrats and actively Democrats, right? But perhaps a more kind of stronger example is religion. I mean, people really do identify with their religious beliefs, and they do not just say, I worship choose your God, right? And they actually are a person of that religion. That defines who they are, right? And then you have the more fun examples like Packers fans. There are certainly some people out there that identify as Packers fans more than anything else, right? And the thing is that research has shown that these group identities, when you really strongly identify with a group and not just affiliate with it, you are far more likely to act on behalf of that group. You will respond personally to attacks on the group and to things that favor the group. So if the Packers win, you feel good. You actually feel good. You feel personally good. And if the Packers lose, you feel personally bad, even though their actions really have nothing to do with your life, and unfortunately, your actions have nothing to do with the outcome of the game, right? And so, from the perspective of people that are trying to maybe target people for marketing, this is extremely useful information to know about a person. Right? You know what groups they belong to, and you know whether they are somebody that might be interested in your product if your product is associated with some sort of group identity. Similarly, if you're interested in passing information along, we actually hypothesize that the groups that you really identify with, you're going to be more likely to not just seek out information about those groups, but also share information about those groups. And that's part of the research that I'll be talking about. But in order to know what these groups are, we have to be able to infer it from something. And what we're looking at is social media, and particularly Twitter. So this approach falls under the heading of latent attribute inference. Right? So what we know, is the things that you post on Twitter or your blog or your Facebook profile. Right? That's what we know. What we don't know is which of these groups you are affiliating with. And sometimes we don't know what your gender is, right? Sometimes we don't know what your political affiliation is, or how strongly you identify with that political party. Sometimes we don't know if you just drink Starbucks on occasion, or if you're really a Starbucks person, right? And it's really interesting how sometimes these brands really can also become group identities. there are people that are very strongly Coke people, right, and very much not Pepsi people, because if you're a Coke person, you're not a Pepsi person, right? And so being able to understand and infer these groups, these latent attributes, can be very useful. So some of this prior research that has done this, I'm going to talk about 3 studies. This first one is with Rao, Yurovsky, and others. And basically what they did is they looked at, again, they're looking at Twitter, and they're trying to infer gender and politics. And the way that they found, so in order to be able to do this, in order to be able to test your inference, you actually have to have ground truth. You actually have to know the labels, but then you pretend that you don't. You look at their, the tweets or whatever, and then you see whether you can predict those labels that you're pretending you don't know. Now, what these guys did is they chose users from these group-relevant Twitter lists. So for gender, they went to sororities, right, and pulled all of the users that were in the sororities list. And they chose fraternities and pulled all of the users that were in the fraternities list. For the politics, they found hashtags that they kind of just predetermined were going to be politically related. So proud Democrat versus support Freedom. And so then the users that had used these hashtags, they assumed were Democrats or Republicans. Right? So in this study, there's actually 2 complications. One is that the ground truth classification might not actually be right. Not everybody that is listed in a sorority list is necessarily a woman. I mean, yes, higher probability, but not necessarily so. Not everybody that tweets proud Democrat is necessarily actually a Democrat. The tweet content could just be, oh, Democrats are stupid, blah, 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 proud Democrats, so that it's heard by Democrats, right? That's one problem, but the other problem, I think, which is sort of more pertinent to the results, the research that I'm about to tell you about, is that these groups are clearly defined and selecting into these categories in a way, right? So if you're using Proud Democrat, you're probably using your Twitter account for politics, or at the very least in the tweets in which you have that, you were very clearly talking about being a Democrat, right? So in this next study, Pennacchiotti and Popescu, they looked at more than just politics. They also looked at this, are you a Starbucks person? And what they did is there are these sites we follow at Twello, in which people can log onto the site and say, my Twitter account is about being a Republican, or is about Starbucks or coffee drinking, right? And so they pulled their users from this list, and they're doing this so that they can, so that they know for sure what the ground truth is with these people. Because otherwise, they're not going to be able to know, is this person really a Democrat? Is this person really a Republican? And so in a way, this is an intentionally biased sample. It's intentionally biased because they need to know the ground truth label. And in this last one, Zamal and Ruth's, again, they pulled their users from this we follow our Twello in order to get the ground truth labels. Now I want to point out that in these, the accuracy ranged between 82% to basically 89% here, 89% here. So they're doing a pretty good job of predicting the underlying classes of these Twitter users based on their tweets. But we want to ask is, well, okay, given these methods, how well can you infer the group identity of a typical user, right? I mean, most people that are on Twitter are not on Twitter to talk about one particular issue. And often the people that are on it to talk about one particular issue are doing it to sort of self-promote or promote a business or something like that, right? They're the social media gurus or what have you, right? I mean, these are the people that are not using their accounts like normal users. But the fact of the matter is the majority of people on Twitter and the majority of people that are online are just normal. They're just using it to maybe listen from about news. Oftentimes, in reality, people have multiple group identities, right? You don't just identify with one group. You maybe identify as being Jewish and identify as being a Packers fan, right? you have multiple group identities. And so your Twitter account isn't going to reflect, the typical user's Twitter account isn't going to reflect a single group identity. It's going to be a distribution over these entities. It's going to be a mixture of these entities, as well as just random conversations that they're having with their friends that have nothing to do with groups at all. Right? And so what we did in order to sort of get at this question, rather than pre-selecting people on the basis of their group identity, right, getting this by a sample, we just picked a set of random Twitter users and asked them to complete a survey. I'll tell you about the participants in just a minute, but basically what we did is we had them come in and log into our application, and our application is not TwitPic, this is just an example of what it looks like, but they log in using their Twitter account, so we know that they have a Twitter account so that we can get access to their tweets. And then we asked them survey questions. So we asked them about their national identity and their political identity, and for both of these things, we gave them this survey. It's this kind of well-tested survey on in-group identification by Leach and colleagues. And it basically has these 5 factors of solidarity, which is I feel a bond with my in-group. Satisfaction, which is, I'm glad to be whatever the in-group is. Centrality, which means I often think of the fact that I am an in-group member. Individual self-stereotyping, so I feel similar to the typical or the average in-group member. And then in-group homogeneity, so in-group people have a lot in common with each other. And so we asked these these are the 5 factors. There's a total of 14 questions. And we asked that about their national identity and their political identity if they were in the US. Right? We also asked them to contribute an additional 3 identities that they identify, an additional 3 groups with whom they strongly identify. Right? And so this way, with the political identity and the national identity, we can compare across users for the people that are strongly identified and weakly identified. But then for these 3 additional identities that they offer, we can see whether for those groups it's very clear in their Twitter profiles, right? For instance, maybe you're not really strongly identified as a Democrat, so it might be hard to kind of infer that from your Twitter stream, but presumably you are strongly identified as, say, a Packers fan, and that should be easily identifiable from your Twitter stream, or at least that was our reasoning. So our participants, we got about 400 from Mechanical Turk before we were shut down for violating the terms of service, because apparently you can't ask them to sign in with Twitter, but we got 400. And then the remainder we got from the Indiana University subject pool. So as I mentioned, my colleague on this is at Indiana and has access to the freshman undergrad psychology students who all have to participate in experiments through school credit. Let me tell you about our participants. As you might expect, the majority are American. The next largest population is Indian, and that comes from the Mechanical Turk population. And then we have this wide distribution of countries. In fact, our participants came from 40 different countries. The age distribution is highly centered around the median, which is 20, which makes sense because, again, the majority of our participants were college students. But we had some who reported being, in their 50s and 60s. In terms of political identity, we actually chose the 5 most. We only gave them the option of identifying with one of the 5 most popular parties in the United States. So, of course, that's Republican, Democrat, but it's also Libertarian, Green Party, and Constitution Party. We had very slightly more Democrats than Republicans, but overall, it was actually a pretty unbiased sample, which was nice. This graph on the left, I guess you're right, is the composite political identity. So they were asked, this is sort of a measure of how strongly they identify between 0 and 100. There's a large spike in the middle, which is basically people saying, I'm kind of wishy-washy, I'm only moderately identified. But we have other than that spike, we have a fairly normal distribution. For our participants, we crawl their tweets. There are certain limits in the API in terms of what we can crawl, and we also set limits on ourselves so that we could do it in a reasonable amount of time. We got 3,200 tweets, up to 3,200 tweets per person, and then up to 1,000 tweets for every person, every user that person follows. This resulted in about a little bit over 82 million tweets, and of those, 500,000 came from our participants. So our participants, and I want to stress this, our participants are actually typical Twitter users, right? So the median number of followers is 118. The median number of friends, that is the people that they follow, is 142 and a half. And the median number of tweets is just under 700, right? So these are very normal users. They're not, for the most part, they're not absent Twitter users. They actually use Twitter. The median is 700. And they have followers and friends, but we have a nice distribution. And I want to point out these are histograms of the followers, friends, and statuses, number of tweets. And it's on a log scale on the x-axis, so these are actually log normal distributions, which again is what you would expect and what other studies have reported with respect to Twitter users. Our kind of most popular user has about 10,000 followers, so that's near celebrity, or near minor celebrity. And the most tweets that any one person had was, I think, on the order of nearly 60,000 tweets for one person. So we also had the very active person, but for the most part, we had just normal, typical users. And importantly, we weren't sampling these users on the basis of their group identity. We were randomly sampling them, or sampling them from these different populations, and then asking them about their group identity. So our objective is to replicate this one study. So Zamal and Roos had the highest accuracy, and so we thought we would borrow their methodology and see how their methodology applies to typical users rather than these high samples. And the features that we used, which are the ones that they used, are from their tweets, the single words, bigrams, so this is pair of words, and trigrams, so this is sets of 3 words that appeared in the tweets, the hashtags, the URL domains, and then, and so those are all textual features. And then we also included features that represented the set of people that they follow, with the reasoning that maybe you're not tweeting about being a Democrat very much, but you're following Barack Obama, right? And if you are, then that would be a pretty good signal, right? So what we did is for these, for each of these tokens, so you can say single words is a token or hashtags is a token. For each of these, we calculated the probability of that token appearing given the class of the user. Right? So, for instance, what is the probability of using the word Palin given that you're a Democrat, right? Versus what is the probability of you using the word Palin given you're a Republican, right? And what we did is for each class, we calculated the top 200 most probable words, or the words that were most probable given your class. So this was sort of our feature input. This is what we were using to try to, these top 200 tokens for words, bigrams, hashtags, etc., is what we were using as the input to try to infer the hidden attribute of that is the category of the user, the group identity of the user. So for this supervised learning task, the first thing that we did is we selected a set of the users to be the seeds. And with these seeds, we constructed these token lists. We inferred the work, we found the top 200 words given from the seeds, right? We found the top 200 words given the class. Then we had a set of users that were a training set. So we said, okay, for these users that are not the seeds, let's learn parameters that on these features that best predict the identity of this training set. And then we take those parameters and try to use them to try to predict the category for some held out sample of users. Okay? And so this is the results that I'm going to present are ROC curves. In case you're not familiar with it, I'm just going to walk through it really quickly. So imagine that you have two classes, positive and negative, okay? And we'll say that positive, for the sake of the explanation, we'll say that positive is men and negative is women. And the one feature we're looking at is height. Okay? Now, if you look at the distribution of height for women, which is this end of the class, and the distribution of height for men, of course they're going to overlap, right? And so if you set some decision boundary and you say, okay, at this point, if they're taller than this, I'm going to say they're a man, and if they're shorter than this, I'm going to say they're a woman, right? Well, let's say that you set your boundary here at this solid one, then everything that's in this area right here, you're going to be correct on. Everything that's in this area here, you're going to be correct on. But here, you're going to have a false positive. You're going to call women men. And here, you're going to have a false negative, which is you're going to call men women, right? So the shorter men. Now, you can imagine putting this line at a bunch of different points, right? And looking at the ratio, or the difference between the true positives and the true negatives. The true positives and the false positives, right? So what is the ratio of this area to this area? And as you move this threshold, it's going to change, and it's going to create a curve. So I'll just give you this one, which is, this is us predicting gender for the typical users based on these features, right? Now, so as we've moved this criterion along, we get these different points, and it creates this curve. If we had absolutely no information that could distinguish between, in the previous example, men and women, it would follow right along this dashed line, right? If it was perfect, if we could perfectly distinguish, if there's absolutely no overlap in height between men and women, for instance, we would be able to choose a decision point at which there's only ever all true positives, right? We choose that decision point, and it's only ever all true positives. And so that would just be this kind of what's on the edge. And so the farther that you are from this diagonal line, the better you're doing in your classifications. So that's the takeaway. And so here, with gender, we're actually doing a pretty good job. We're doing about as good as Simone and Roos did on gender. So we've got an AUC of 0.82. This actually corresponds to an accuracy of closer to 0.88. So this is right along the lines of what they were able to do. When we did it with the salient political users, so we actually took politicians and applied this methodology on their tweets and saw how well we did. And the reason that you don't see anything here is not because it's on the diagonal line, but because it's on the axes, right? So we actually were able to perfectly predict the political identity of these politicians given their tweets and using the features that we were looking at. So this is great. Now, for comparison, in these other studies, they were getting, just as a reminder, they were getting about 82 to 89% accuracy. The reason that we do better than that, I think, is because we just had a smaller sample size. Right? So I think, probably if we had a bigger sample size, either more tweets or more users, more politicians, that is, maybe we probably wouldn't be able to get this perfect accuracy. But the point is that we're essentially replicating the results, right? Using their methods, we're able to do a good job of predicting the political affiliation of these people. Okay. So what happens when we do the same method and apply it to just the users in our sample, these typical users, that say that they identify with a particular political party, but it is not why they're not self-selected into anything to say that they are a Democrat or they are a Republican. Well, when we use just typical seed users, so the word lists that we're looking at, the features that we're looking at, are coming from typical users, and then we're training it and testing it on typical users. Our area under the curve is 0.63, and so this corresponds to an accuracy of 0.62. It's just not really as good. So we thought, well, maybe the problem is that the features, the words that our seed users are using aren't really politically oriented. But maybe if we train, use the words of the politicians right? And then see how often our typical users are using the words of the politicians. That'll give us a better accuracy. And it did, but not really. Right? So we had, marginal improvement, but that could be in the norms. And in fact, if you just look at the best feature, the one that does the best job of predicting, it's who they follow. It has nothing to do with their tweets at all. And even this, so this is one feature, and it's doing nearly as good as the entire model with all of the text and everything. So, this says that things aren't working quite well. So, when you're looking at the accuracy of these models, inferring this, group identity of the typical user, not so good. And so we are trying to figure out why. What is the reason that we're seeing such a clear difference? And it's, I think, really well illustrated when you look at the sort of most distinctive features for the salient users versus the typical users, right? So for the politicians, for the salient political users, these are the kind of most predictive hashtags for the two classes, right? And so one is cuts we can't afford, big oil, rob me not ready, right? And then the other one is Obama agenda, pro-life, cut spending now, right? Super clear, very obvious, very understandable what is differentiating between these two things, right? When we, yeah, Chris.
Winter, just a question on the hashtag in terms of sentiment. How do you, I can understand it, Obama agenda or, cut taxes, but can you really infer positive as well as negative sentiment based on the hashtag?
So we're not actually using sentiment at all. That is actually something that we thought about doing. Essentially, we're just going on the assumption that if you're using, for instance, pro-life or Obama agenda, right? There's one A there. Then you're probably kind of in that group and you're having that discussion, right? And in fact, I think this is probably correct because for the salient political users, we had a very excellent job, did a very excellent job of predicting their actual affiliation. And the same sort of thing applies when you look at the gender of our typical users, right? So these are the most predictive features for gender for our typical users, right? And so on the top, T Swift, Taylor Swift, sisters, please, boyfriends, things my daddy taught me. And then for the other group, Halo, college game day, no shave November. The puck for Purdue comes from the Indiana folks. There's a rivalry with Purdue University. I'll just leave it at that. Okay. So with gender, again, these words are actually, just intuitively, you look at them and you see, yes, okay, these are useful features for determining, if somebody is using No Shave November, high probability they're a guy, right? So this is clearly a useful signal, right? When we look at the best, most predictive hashtags of political identity for our typical users, great night, seriously though, road trip, right? The only one that's kind of reasonable at all is Obama, right? And so with that one, you can sort of say, oh, okay, I think the top one's probably Republicans and the bottom one's Democrats, right? But in general, the things that people are talking about on Twitter just, even though these people, say that they identify with these different political parties, they're in the survey, they're classifying themselves as being Republican or Democrat. On Twitter, that is not what they're doing, right? And so this makes it challenging. So although we think that it's kind of interesting to know that there's a difference between the typical users and these kind of salient users that have been looked at before in prior research, we also are actually just interested in inferring the group identities. And so we're trying to improve the accuracy. So how are we going to do that? Well, one way that we can do it is by expanding the features that we're using. Maybe the textual features that we're looking at aren't enough of a signal. This is sort of what we saw. So, maybe we can dig into the content of the URLs. Right now, we're just looking at the domain names of the URLs that they're creating. Maybe we can actually dig into the content of the actual pages that they're sharing and see if that provides any additional information. We also might want to maybe look at some deeper linguistic features, things like, okay, let's say we only look at tweets that include the word we, right? That's a nice signal of group identity, that you're talking about groups in some way, right? And so, so maybe filtering down to that, or filtering tweets with action verbs, or doing sentiment analysis, for instance, right? And seeing how that ties in with these other features. Additionally, we can look at the tweets of the users that are being followed and see if that provides additional information, kind of inferring that maybe you're not really politically active, but maybe you follow somebody that is, and so their tweets will be a good signal of what category you belong to. We also think, basically what we did here was just apply some off-the-shelf machine learning algorithms, right? The supervised learning, we used support vector machines, which is a classic classification algorithm. But there are more sophisticated things, and in fact, I've been working on this model here. It's a graphical model with Bayesian updating. I'm not going to tell you too much about it, but basically the idea is that each tweet, we're going to say that each tweet is representing some part of a person's identity, right? And so, and we're going to say that each person has a multiple set of identities. And so we're going to try to infer what that set of identities is from their tweets, under the assumption that, one, these identities are shared across multiple users, and two, that each tweet belongs to a single identity. So the kind of main conclusion here is really just this kind of realization that basically prior research has overestimated the ability to infer these group identities, right? There's been these 3 papers that we looked at were reporting this excellent accuracy of 90% and nearly 90%, but you can't actually obtain that if you're looking at a random sample of users. And so all of these prior results are sort of compromised by this selection bias. And so there's still work to be done in order to be able to generalize and infer classes from a wider set of users. So for our next steps, what we want to do is, as I said, improve the accuracy of the classifier. But we also want to see if we can test this classifier on the user's self-nominated groups, right? So presumably these are the things that they are, the groups that they're more strongly identified with. And so these are the most popular groups. Like several of these groups are actually shared amongst our users. So student, American, woman, college student, and athlete. Hoosier is a student that goes to Indiana University. Christian, Jew, And so, we might select these and see how we do in predicting these, because maybe these self-nominated groups are the things that they really care about, and the political identity is just something that's marginal. We also want to see if we can actually predict the strength of group identity. So far, all the prior research on this has treated group identity as a binary attribute. You either are or you are not, right? But in actuality, we have a gradient in terms of how strongly we identify with these different groups. And ideally, we would like to actually predict that strength and not just kind of whether you are or not. Something that I think is a little bit more exciting and the direction that I'm really interested in taking this is, let's say that we get a classifier up to even just the level of these other, this other work, right? So for the typical user, we're able to infer their group identity 9% with 90% accuracy, right? So let's say that that's true. Now let's also say that the probability that you're going to seek out information and share information is dependent on your group identity. Then, as a marketer, you want to be able to identify not just whether somebody is strongly identified, but also whether they are connected to a large group of people that share that same identity and are strongly identified with that identity. So, an example, you might find somebody that is, just the biggest Packers fan that exists anywhere in the United States, but he lives in Minnesota. And so everybody he's connected to is a Vikings fan. And so absolutely, you know, you've got this great new product. It's a telephone in the shape of Brett Favre's face, and you want to, like, you know, sell this to your Green Bay Packers fans. And you see, okay, well, let's just find the people that are most strongly identified. Well, you find this one guy and you target it to him, and yes, he's going to buy it because he loves the Packers. But you know, he's going to tell all his friends, and they're, well, I guess that's not the best example because they're Brett Favre loves the Vikings. But let's say it's a cheesehead thing, and then you know, none of his friends are going to buy it. Whereas if you find somebody that's maybe a little bit less identified, but is surrounded and connected to a large group of people that are similarly identified, then the reach of targeting a single person is going to be much greater. And one thing that's nice is that we actually had our users follow us. We have a Twitter account for the purpose of this experiment, and we had them follow that account. So now we can actually tweet different URLs that contain group relevant or group irrelevant information and measure the probability that somebody picks this up and decides to share it with their friends. So we can actually exactly measure the effect, the size of the effect of information being group relevant relative to being group irrelevant. I want to thank NSF for getting us off out here last summer. I want to thank Thomas Filippo and Tansi Mark, who are here and helped build the infrastructure for crawling Twitter, and Kara Fesson, who's an undergraduate at Indiana that helped us out conduct the research and get all these people to sign up on Twitter. Thank you.
Anyone have any questions for Winter?
When you were talking about the connections between the groups, are you making first connections or second connections? Meaning,
I think that ideally what you want is essentially, let's say that let's take a really false model for the sake of argument, and if you identify with this group, you will share with 100% probability, and if you are not identified with the group, you will not share with 100% probability, right? As a marketer, you then want to find the biggest connected group. And in fact, like assuming directed connections like this on Twitter, you want to find the root that is going to connect that of the biggest tree so that you can reach the largest number of people. Because it is assumed that, you know, I'm a Packers fan and I buy this cheesehead thing, and you're following me and you see that I bought this cheesehead thing, and then you buy it because with probability 100 you're going to get it. And so it will cascade to all the followers. So what you want to do is not just target the person that's most strongly identified, you want to target the biggest tree.
so target the followers of the followers?
So you just target the very first person, and that person buys it, and then his followers, and then her followers, and
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess like political identity would be time dependent too. In the region before an election, you're strongly Democrat or strongly Republican, and then maybe 4 months after an election, you just don't care anymore. You're off into petty snooze or whatever. It's gone.
No, that's absolutely true, and in fact, Asaf's advisor, that is the question that he's most interested in, and we've sort of said, okay, once we've sort of gotten to that point where we can look at that, we're going to do that. Because in the psychological literature around group identity, that's actually something that hasn't been addressed basically at all, because in the psychological literature, you're largely limited to doing your research in a laboratory setting, right? Whereas here, you know, if we can actually predict the group identity, we can do that where we look at it over time and see how people's the salience of people's group identities changes over time and potentially in response to different cues.
I would figure something pretty innocuous, like if you're an Irish music lover or you like pencils or something like that, would be a lot easier to look at than something that's time dependent or
my suspicion is that to some extent all group identities are time dependent in that there are some times where you're going to be more strongly identified than others. And it's just a question of, like, I think political identity is just that when you're not really identifying, it's completely gone, right? It's like you're really off the radar. Whereas in others, it's maybe like more versus less versus rather than some versus none.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you.